On behalf of the International Pollutants Elimination Network and our co-sponsor, the National Toxics Network in Australia, we warmly welcome you to this global webinar, Exporting Plastic Fuel, the new reality after Australia's plastic waste export ban in Southeast Asia. I'm Lee Bell, your facilitator for this webinar. I am an advisor to the National Toxics Network, and also I am the POPs and Mercury advisor to the International Pollutants Elimination Network, and have been involved in waste trade, plastic issues and hazardous waste issues for many years. Before we proceed, please allow me to share these reminders. This webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made public on IPEN's YouTube channel. Language interpretations for Bahasa Indonesia and French are available. You may click on the interpretation button at the lower part of your screen for the language of your choice. There will be a question and answer session towards the end of the webinar, but you may type your question at any time using the Q&A button function, which is below. Lastly, we would like to invite you all to complete the post-webinar survey following the webinar itself. To formally open our program today, I'd like to invite Tadesse Amera, IPEN's co-chair, to give the opening remarks. Tadesse, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lee. I'm very happy to be here and to see that this progress is going on. Hello, everyone. I am Tadesse Amera, the IPEN co-chair from Ethiopia, but currently I'm talking to you from Nairobi, where many things are happening at the United Nations Environment Assembly at the UN compound here. You may listen some voices in the background because there are many ministers from the whole world coming here to decide for many issues, including plastics. So this is an important event, an important webinar, especially from the decision which is going to be taken from this side of the world. Before I go to tell you what's going on in Nairobi, for some of you who may not know IPEN, I would like to give you just 2 points. IPEN is an international pollutant elimination network, which is a member of more than 600 NGO members in 128 countries. And this team is working for a toxic-free future. IPEN works on many chemicals issues, including plastics. And when we are talking about plastics, we are talking not only on the visible aspect of the waste, but what's in that, the toxics part and the chemicals part. IPEN is working on the chemicals part, and we consider that plastics are have liability on human health from the additives that they have, the chemical additives that they have. With regards to this, we are here in Nairobi negotiating with governments for a legally binding treaty. And I'm very glad to inform you all now, at least the UNIA process allowed and opened a door for negotiations to make a legally binding treaty in the future. So this is already a resolution, a draft resolution is already accepted. It will be adopted by UNIA. And in the coming years, at least for 2 years, there will be intergovernmental negotiation committee formed, and before that, preparatory meetings will come. Within that process, what are we going to consider is the next slide. When we talk about plastics, as I said before, we are not just talking about the visible, the huge, the waste aspect only. Plastics have hazardous wastes, and they are mix of chemicals. When we form plastics, we form plastics with chemicals and carbon integrating them with polymers and there are endocrine disrupting chemicals, flame retardants, and many more carcinogenic substances. And some of them not only affect us and the environment, even they can pass through placenta to the unborn children. So these are the main aspects that we are trying to convey to this venue. One of the topics that's entertained is recycling. Recycling is not really a very best solution because when we are talking about recycling as well, if chemicals are there, we are just creating a circle for that hazardous chemical to come to us again and again, and it will sustain in our circle forever. So how can we consider also that as a means of a solution, which is not, which is even entertaining with a false sense of security. That's another aspect that we are trying to deal with. So the other thing is the lack of transparency and lack of data about the toxic chemicals in plastics and products on the market are the main aspects also that we are trying to convey in the coming negotiations. And coming back to this webinar from the Australian ban, some sugar coating is also going on. We ban, but how are we going to manage that? Is the solution just burning? We are going from one problem to another.
It looks like we may have lost Dr. Tedesse Emera, co-chair of IPEN for the moment due to a technical difficulty. Perhaps he can rejoin us later in the presentation. So for now, I'll just move on and provide some background to today's webinar. Just recently, Australia introduced a so-called world-first waste export ban, but closer scrutiny reveals that despite the ban, Australia is intent on continuing to export plastic waste redefined as fuel, otherwise known as refuse-derived fuel, sometimes called process-engineered fuel, and there are other names for it as well. And they want to export it particularly to ASEAN countries. The country's plastic waste fuel export model effectively shatters Australia's pledge to cease exports of waste to ASEAN states and ignores Southeast Asian countries' efforts to resist international waste dumping and pollution colonisation. This also undermines the objective of the recently ratified amendment to the Basel Convention on the control of transboundary movements of hazardous wastes and their disposal, to stop trade in hazardous waste from richer countries to poorer countries as fuel products, not regulated by the convention. This is an important point. The Basel Convention regulates waste, not products, and renaming what is effectively shredded waste as a fuel product helps the Australian government to avoid the regulatory controls of the Basel Convention. And you'll hear some more about that a little later. To investigate the problem, IPEN and National Toxics Network in Australia examined Australia's policy on waste management and exports in a study called Australian Refuse-Derived Fuel Product or Plastic Waste Export in Disguise. In addition, IPEN's partners in Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines have produced reports assessing each country's capacity to manage residual wastes, including exports and the associated regulatory frameworks and the legislation governing refuse-derived fuel or RDF use. Joining us today are the experts behind these globally important reports, and we're grateful that they're sharing their expertise and time with us today. Our first speaker today is Jane Bremer from Australia, a member of the National Toxics Network. Jane co-founded the Environmental Justice Group, Alliance for a Clean Environment, in 1998, after experiencing firsthand the impacts of living next to Western Australia's worst toxic site, left by a US waste oil company. They successfully campaigned for site cleanup and introduction of Australia's first contaminated sites law. From 2004 to 2014, Jane served in the Community Engagement Forum of the Federal Regulator of Industrial Chemicals, known as NICNAS, leading to the successful implementation of the existing Chemicals Review, to address the backlog of unassessed chemicals in Australia. Currently, Jane is coordinator for the National Toxics Network and leads the Zero Waste Australia campaign, as well as working collaboratively with IPEN as a participating organisation and Asia Pacific regional member. Jane also represents Australia as a core member of Break Free from Plastic Movement and the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives. Jane, the floor is yours. Thank you.
So thank you. I'm very excited to be speaking with you today about this important project. Firstly, I'd like to say my name's Jane Bremer. I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people of the city of Boorloo, that's in Perth, Western Australia. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So it's our waste and it's our responsibility, said the Prime Minister of Australia. And Australians were really relieved and proud about this declaration from our Prime Minister about a world-first ban on waste plastic exports. So we decided to take a closer look at the legislative framework that came from that announcement to see exactly what that meant. And it prompted us to pursue this project and to provide this information to you today with my colleagues I'm very happy to speak with from Indonesia, the Philippines and Malaysia. So the Prime Minister's announcement...
Just a moment, Jane, if I could just interrupt. Your PowerPoint's not showing at the moment on your shared screen.
Okay.
I'll just try sharing screen again. There we are. That's working. Thank you, Jane. Sorry.
If I was to go to full screen, can you see the full screen or can you see all my other... Just going back, I was speaking about the world first ban on waste plastic exports from our Prime Minister, which resulted in this new piece of legislation, the Recycling and Waste Reduction Act. And what drove the Prime Minister's announcement way back then was really have to give credit to Julian Wang's incredible documentary, Plastic China, which exposed the horrific situation of plastic waste dumping throughout China and the Southeast Asian region. And as we saw, a number of countries in the Southeast Asian region, particularly Indonesia, the Philippines and Malaysia, responded with similar restrictions. And this was due to the incredible and harmful pollution impacts that these countries are suffering as a result of overwhelming volumes of unrecyclable and dirty plastic waste and waste exports. So when we look take a closer look at the new Australian legislation and policy framework behind this Australian waste export ban, what we see is a number of policies that really are all leading to the same direction, and that is predominantly waste to energy. And when I say waste to energy, I'm including the refuse-derived fuel production industry and the infrastructure around facilitating that. So most people are not really aware that Australia really doesn't have a very sophisticated waste management system compared to other OECD countries. So we don't separate our waste well. Our waste management system has really been dominated by the waste disposal sector, and we see that reflected in our government policy and legislation. So there was a lot of grand statements made, a lot of wonderful policy work generated, but behind a lot of those grand claims is really not very much, and quite a lot that we need to be concerned about. Pretty much most of the policy related, particularly to plastic waste, is really market-driven solutions and promoting self-regulatory models. And this is a concern because, as we've seen with the Australian Packaging Covenant organisation, they've had 20 years of industry self-regulation so far. Australia is a big fan of industry self-regulation. They don't like to have strict regulations. We see that reflected in these policies. So when we look at these policies, what we can see is many of them lead to three outcomes, and that is chemical recycling, refuse-derived fuel generation, and incineration. Some of those are rephrased as resource recovery, some are termed recycling, some are termed reprocessing. All of this terminology seems to be interchangeable in Australia, and recycling can mean recovery, recovery can mean reprocessing, reprocessing can mean recycling. All these terms are used interchangeably. And when we take a really close look at this, we can see that the three main outcomes all involve burning plastic waste. And that is because as we know, most plastic waste is multi-layered composite materials that can't actually be recycled, and that are really streaming into the downcycled outcome, going into roads, going into park benches, going into products and materials that can't be recycled again. But getting back to Australia's waste plastic export ban, we can see that it delivers two clear outcomes, and I want to focus on those. The first is that in Australia, you will only be allowed to export single polymers or single resins or processed engineered fuel. And what that tells us, and what we see this reflected in the policy and legislative framework, is that because most plastic is not recyclable, it will be going into a fuel product, and that will be burnt in Australia and in the Southeast Asian region. So we know that the Australian government's waste export ban announcement elicited what's been bragged about in the media in several arenas, is a $7.8 billion investment in waste management in Australia. And sadly, we see that when we look at where that money is going, we can see that it's going to RDF production, incineration, and chemical recycling. But more worryingly is the funding and the subsidies they're getting from those agencies in the Australian government that were set up to support the renewable energy and the clean energy sectors. So we're talking about the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. And as we can see here in their publications, they promote two of the big incinerator projects in Western Australia's Asia Pacific Waste Deals of the Year. And we can see that considerable amount of money has been given to these projects to help them establish. And these really are not clean or renewable energy projects. We know that burning waste, we know that burning RDF is extremely climate polluting and releases a lot of toxic air pollution. So it's not clean energy and it's not renewable energy. And it really is very unfair of the Australian government to literally steal this money away from renewable energy projects to funnel into waste disposal projects, which will increase climate change and pollution. And following yesterday's IPC report announcement, it just underscores the lack of justification for directing these funds to these particular projects. When we take a closer look at where the money is going at a more local level, I just want to give you a good example here of the 18 local government local governments that come under the New South Wales North Coast region. And this is a project that's being pitched to these 18 councils that you can see here provide three outcomes for the management of residual waste in that huge region. The business as usual approach here, but the three options that are being put forward to these local governments are large scale energy from waste incinerators, small scale energy from waste, or RDF production. At a state level, we can see that many states are commissioning market analysis for RDF as well. And when we look to our Southeast Asian colleagues, we can see that there is significant investment in the Australian-Indonesia Plastics Innovation Hub, Resource Co's expansion into the Southeast Asian region, and a whole raft of government and industry partnerships with Southeast Asian governments as well to further refuse-derived fuel production and burning. In addition, I want to just take a moment to highlight the good work that the University of Technology Sydney and its partners here have done in investigating the impacts of Australia's plastic waste exports in the region. But I'm highlighting this to demonstrate that the Australian government, as they have made very clear at UNEA and publicly, are very focused on continuing plastic waste trade to prevent leakage into the marine environment. And it's really important to highlight this distinction here, because this is not about acknowledging that the pollution flows are coming from land-based sources and come with significant public health impacts. So while this is a great series of studies here that has been designed to support Australia's continued trade in waste plastics, it's very much focused on stopping leakage into the marine environment and not on the human rights, the public health impacts, and the land-based sources of the plastic exports in those countries, as we know, have been shown to be quite significant. We know that RDF is being directed to the cement industry all throughout the world, particularly in Southeast Asia and very much in Australia. And we can see that the cement industry themselves are highlighting the lack of consistent waste management standards throughout Australia as being a gross impediment to their production. So the industry themselves have concerns about the regulatory framework, the definitions and the categorisations, the different waste management systems across the states in Australia, and how that will affect the production of RDF and what it means for the cement industry. So Australia's attempt to develop standards for resource recovery and waste data is being developed as well. And I want to highlight this concern that we have, particularly because we see it in other sectors, and other sectors that, as we know, are part of the full petrochemical, plastic and fossil fuel chain. And that is the issue of commercial in confidence. And we see in the advice that's being given to the federal government to develop their policy that there are provisions for any state in Australia, any government or industry to claim commercial in confidence. And we should be concerned about that, because we know that the biggest cement industry in Western Australia already operates with commercial in confidence and doesn't disclose their pollution emissions. We know that in the fracking industry, they're awarded those commercial in confidence as well. And we know that the fracking industry is part of the petrochemical and plastics industry. So getting back to what is RDF, we know that it has a number of names. Refuse-derived fuel is the overarching name, but we know that under that classification, we have process engineered fuel, solid waste fuel, refuse-derived waste-derived fuel, solid recovered fuels, and even tyre-derived fuels. And we know that they come from these waste streams: the municipal solid waste stream, the commercial and industrial, the construction and demolition waste stream, predominantly and research from our colleagues, this is particularly from Marielle Villele in Zero Waste Europe, highlights that 49% of the RDF made in Europe is made from municipal solid waste. That is despite the industry claiming that it's not. We know that the burning of refuse-derived fuel is very similar in emissions profile to the burning of residual waste in incineration. And these are the kinds of pollutants that we can expect, particularly nitrous oxides and the acid gases. We know that nanoparticle pollution is not regulated anywhere in the world. And yet we know that incinerators and refuse-derived fuel burning facilities like cement plants, like coal facilities that will be taking RDF have no regulation for deadly nanoparticles. When we take a closer look at other research around the world, we can see that those cement kilns that do burn RDF have significantly increased levels of certain pollutants. And I'm highlighting here nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, hydrogen chloride, and total organic compounds. And this research was provided by the International Society for Doctors of the Environment. Why should we be concerned about the pollution and how the Australian government, and indeed governments all around the world, regulate this particular pollution? If we put children's environmental health at the forefront, then we set the highest standards. Yep, that's not something that happens in Australia, and I'm certainly aware that it's not happening in other parts of the world either. And we should be concerned about this because children are not little adults. They don't process pollution the same way that adults do. They inhale, ingest and absorb more pollution. Pollution exposure affects fundamental windows of development, causing long-term impacts. And in short, if we set our standards to protect children's environmental health, we're setting the highest standards for public health and environmental protection. We also know that burning refuse-derived fuel is not part of a circular economy as industry would have us believe and constantly claims. And highlighting the Ellen MacArthur Foundation circular economy diagram here that clearly positions energy recovery and landfill as leakage from the system. So RDF generation and burning is not part of a circular economy. In fact, it is part of the ongoing linear petrochemical system that from raw materials extraction to final disposal, which puts that carbon, those climate pollutants and those toxic air pollutants into the atmosphere, where they are spread all over the planet and deposit in the ocean as persistent organic pollutants in our agricultural systems on our land, and disproportionately impact Indigenous people and people particularly in the vulnerable hot equatorial regions of the world. We know that zero waste systems, particularly recycling and composting, provide far better climate outcomes than burning our waste as refuse-derived fuel. And we know that plastics contain a number of chemical and toxic additives, and you can find a lot of, there have been some questions I can see in the Q&A about this. The inherent hazardous and toxicity aspects of plastics cannot be understated. They do transfer into new products. IPEN has been demonstrating and reporting on that for quite some years and has a number of reports detailing those scientific studies, and very concerning, showing up in children's toys and consumer products that we use daily, like kitchen utensils and things like that. So the issue of toxicity of plastics throughout the entire life cycle is a significant issue, and no less when it goes into recycling, into new products or into RDF. So in summary, our project makes a number of recommendations in the end. We considered that the trade in refuse-derived fuel, it poses such a risk to human health and the environment that it really needs a ban. We need to ban the export of RDF, particularly to vulnerable countries in the Southeast Asian region, where it's already having a very disproportionate adverse impact. We need to set a global regulatory framework around the production of refuse-derived fuel, because there are no consistent standards for its production and no consistent standards for its use or trade. And that is a gross failure in governance globally and has to be rectified immediately because of the significant impacts that RDF poses. And so we're calling for an immediate suspension of RDF use in the ASEAN region, and a transparent scientific assessment of the health and environmental impacts of burning RDF, particularly where it's going to be used in cement kilns and other high-risk industries. So I've probably gone well over time there, so I'll finish, but I'm very happy to take questions, and I'll hand back to Lee. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jane Bremer, there from the National Toxics Network of Australia. Next speaker is Mageshwari Sangaralingam. Magesh is the Senior Research Officer in the Community and Environment section of the Consumers Association of Penang, based in Malaysia, or CAP. With CAP, MAGAS supports communities affected by destructive developments and pollution that negatively impact communities and the environment, and advocates for policy reforms. She's also the Honorary Secretary of the Friends of the Earth Malaysia, coordinating a number of organisations in community and environment projects. Magish, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lee, for the introduction, and Jane for setting the stage. The title of my presentation today is in terms of repackaged waste imports, and we have also done a case study of process engineered fuel in Malaysia. Okay, for all of you, you might. Okay, so in terms of the work that we've been doing, all of you would have, it's been kind of popular that ever since China closed its doors to 24 types of solid waste, including plastic waste, in January 2018, Malaysia became the largest recipient of plastic waste. And a lot of media coverage was on this issue. Yeah, you can go ahead with the next slide, can it? Okay, and the Australian media, such as the 60 Minutes program, it revealed that mixed plastic waste has ended up in illegal dump sites and also recycling plants in Malaysia. Okay, containers of mixed and contaminated plastic waste were opened by the Malaysian authorities. This you can see in the next slide. And this was witnessed and recorded by Australian media. So this whole issue became it was surprising for the Australians also, because when we are segregating our waste, we are putting it in the recycling bins, and we think it's like, okay, going to be recycled properly. But what happened was it ended up in developing countries like Malaysia, Indonesia. Just now you had seen the slide that Jane had shown. Kenneth, you can move to the next one. Jane had shown that the waste was being burnt in Indonesia, or it was caught in flames. Okay, so from the next slide, what we had done was we were trying to track the waste, yeah, that was being exported from Australia and also other developed countries to Malaysia. But then there's, in terms of the tracking the waste, it was also kind of difficult because there is no harmonized system for this type of waste, this waste derived fuel, RDF, that Jane had already explained. So there are many types of waste like fire derived fuel, process engineered fuel. So in the next slide, you will see that in terms of the how many HS codes are there. So HS 3915, this is a general one for scraps of plastics or plastic waste. But then there are also other types of plastic waste, depending on the resin codes. So there are different categories. So in terms of residual products or RDF, what we have found was HS 3825.1 was being used. But for process engineered fuel, we had got this from the Singapore Customs. They had a ruling that HS 3606.90.10 is the code for process engineered fuel. But for you to get those data, it's kind of difficult, because it may be interchanged, and it depends on what the exporter is going to define in terms of the waste that they are sending. For us, it is waste. But for what Australia is saying, no, because you are accepting it. This is a commodity. We are trading commodities. They are not saying they are trading waste. Okay, so the next slide, please. So so this is the Australia's waste export to Malaysia. Our study, we had got the information from the UN Comms Trade. Yeah, and so HS 3915, you can see that it had been slowly increasing. 2018, it was 44,000, nearly 45 million kilograms, but it had decreased because Malaysia had a temporary moratorium, and then they only issued approved permits. So in terms of PEF, we had also checked. In 2014, there was like nearly 14 million kilograms of process engineered fuel that was being sent to Malaysia. And for that, they did not consider that as waste. It was considered as solid fuel when it was being imported from by Malaysia. Yeah? And in 2015, you can see it was nearly 5 million. What happened from 2016 to 2020? We see that there's no more PEF which was being exported from Australia to Malaysia. Okay, so so this is the query. Yeah? Most of you will be thinking, what happened? in 2015 for this PEF to be stopped from importing. So next, so what happened was in 2015, our sister organizations, Sahabat Alam Malaysia, together with the Consumer Association of Penang, we had conducted a protest in front of the facility which was processing this process engineered fuel, which was being imported from Australia. This was because what we had information that the waste that was being brought in were kind of mixed waste, and when the Department of Environment went and did their enforcement and also surveillance work, they found that there was electronic waste. Yeah, just a bit of electronic waste, but then electronic waste is considered as hazardous waste under the Basel Convention. So this is already not adhering to our laws, and also Malaysia as a party to the Basel Convention and Basel Ban Amendment, and so this is against the law. So what Malaysia did is they stopped giving permits to the particular facility to import more waste from Australia. Okay, next. So what the facility is doing now is they are only sourcing local waste. Okay, so Jane had already explained about the Australia's rules, yeah, the new waste trade laws. But is Australia actually banning waste exports? Because we think that, you know, we were happy when Australia announced that they're going to ban waste exports. But then what the details is, yeah, you can see the details later on in the next page. Next slide. So in terms of the plastic rules, you can see that they're no longer able to export mixed waste plastics. Yeah, you can see in that. And from 1st of July 2022, the exporter can export plastic waste that have been sorted into single resin or polymer type and further processed, for example, flaked or pelletized or processed into process engineered fuel. So we can still be getting this kind of waste. So so if Malaysia now then thinks, okay, yeah, we can allow, because now it's like waste to be imported as process engineered fuel, then probably we will, you know, there will be still be the dumping that goes on here. Okay, next. We will be looking at the tires. So tires that can be exported from Australia is also the ones which are shredded into crumbs, and it is called tire derived fuel. Yeah, so this is also, it's still coming into Malaysia, this tire derived fuel. How did we find it? Next, because sometimes, you know, if you don't go out on field or you don't see this waste on the field, we would not know whether it's coming or not. Okay, next please. Okay, so it came out in the papers. That's how we knew, because during the pandemic, none of us could go out. Yeah, we could not go out on field, we could not conduct surveys, but so we were relying a lot on media articles. And so in June 2021, there was an article saying that, you know, crumb of rubber was blazing in flames, and when the media went there, they found that it was tire derived fuel, which was being imported from Australia. Yeah, so this was also in an article that we came across. Next, please. So in that article, it mentions here, no, the next one. It is mentioned in the article that the waste is coming from Australia, shipped from Australia to be used as fuel for a plastic recycling factory in Timor, and also a cement factory in Langkawi. So waste is still being brought in from Malaysia, from Australia to Malaysia to be processed. And this is a chart that we took from one of the facilities which was processing TDF in Australia, and which is sending this TDF, considered commodity now, to Malaysia, Japan, Korea, Philippines. Yeah, next please. So essentially, we are still bringing in waste from Australia, but in repackaged as something else. And there are 9 cement plants which have been approved for co-processing in Malaysia. And what they co-firing is process engineered fuel, tire derived fuel, refuse derived fuel, scheduled and hazardous. In Malaysia, it's called scheduled waste, but this is essentially hazardous waste. Fly ash, copper slag, sawdust. So you had seen just now, Jane had already presented in terms of the emissions that are coming out from cement plants, yeah, and how it is going to adversely affect our human health, our children's health. So, so we are very much concerned, and we are calling for, Kenneth, you can just go through the next slides quickly, yeah, in terms of the Basel Convention. Next, please. So we had done our advocacy in May 2019, and we brought in certain types of plastics. Next, please. We can go quickly. So in terms of the outcome at Basel Convention, certain plastics were added to the Basel Convention. You need to get prior informed consent, yeah, from the receiving countries. And and this is an important tool for countries to stop dumping of unwanted plastic waste into our countries, yeah, into our developing countries. And it came into effect on 1st of January. Next, please. So in terms of waste-based fuels, this is information that we got from Global Alliance for Incidental Alternatives, where most of us IPEN participating organizations who are also part of this webinar today, we are also part of the Global Alliance for Incidental Alternatives. They had looked into the loopholes, yeah, in the Basel Convention, and also how this kind of RDF and SRF can be included. And it is also relevant under the Basel Convention, trade controls. So, what Gaia is saying, there should be prior informed consent under Basel Convention, as co-processing in cement kilns are not, yeah, to us, it's not destined for environmentally sound recycling. Yeah, this is not being sent. The waste is not being sent for recycling. So our demands, as Jane had already mentioned just now, to prevent dumping, Australia should take responsibility of its own waste, yeah, and this waste colonialism. Next. To ban trade of waste-based fuels and ensure full traceability and transparency of waste shipments. Yeah, and also reinforce monitoring and enforcement measures, because we find that there is a lot of illegal waste trade which is still happening. And what we want is also to prioritize reduction at source, and in terms of plastics also to reduce the production of plastics, and no more false solutions. So cement processing in cement plants is not recycling. Yeah. So this is our call. Thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, we will be happy to respond to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Thanks,
Maggot from the Consumer Association of Penang. A very good presentation. We'll move on now to our third speaker, who is Eileen Lucero from the Philippines. Eileen is a prominent figure in the environmental movement in the Philippines as the national coordinator of the Eco Waste Coalition. Eileen is sought after by both media and policy-making bodies to provide inputs on a wide range of chemical safety and waste issues. The Eco Waste Coalition spearheaded community action against waste dumping from Canada and from South Korea in their country, as well as the fight against lead in paint, amongst many other successful initiatives. The Eco Waste Coalition is the coordination and communication hub for IPEN in the Southeast and East Asian region. Eileen, the floor is now yours.
Good day, everyone. I would like to sincerely thank IPEN and this webinar's organizers for having the Eco Waste Coalition as part of this study on process engineered fuel and share our experience on this plastic waste report in disguise. Before I proceed with our report prepared by Attorney Gregorio Rafael P. Bueta for Eco Waste Coalition and IPEN, let me first introduce to all the organization I came from. In a nutshell, the Eco Waste Coalition is a non-profit environmental health network of over 140 public interest groups. We are guided by our vision of a zero waste and toxics-free society where communities enjoy a safe and healthy environment. In May 7, 2019, the Philippines received a 940-footer container vans from Australia loaded with 211.14 tons of waste materials declared as municipal waste process engineered fuel and were destined to the Holcim cement manufacturing facility. Australia sends its non-recyclable residual municipal waste rebadged as PEF to be burnt in cement kilns. It is a highly deceptive way of sidestepping the provisions of the Basel Convention by declaring the shredded mixed waste as PEF. A deceitful approach to waste management by Australia that should and can manage its own waste. Waste management conducted waste assessment and found out pieces of sorted scrap plastic, cellophane, wrappers, chunks of hard plastic, textile, wood chips, glass, cullet, stones, soil, and other shredded materials inside the plastic wrap bales. These are municipal waste in our eyes. Even the exporter, the source co, describe it as municipal waste in its shipping declaration. However, for Holcim, the cement manufacturing facility, it is low-grade fuel, process-engineered fuel, and not garbage. The cement industry benefits the most from PEF. According to the United Nations Environment Program, or UNEP, the cement industry is the second biggest source. And here in the Philippines, RDF and PEF use is increasing with importation as a key driver. PEF use in the Philippines mostly comes from Australia, as seen in these daily import entries from the Bureau of Customs of the Philippines from the period November 2018 to March 2021. It showed that 15,543,560 kilograms of PEF came into the country. Several laws and issuances govern the use of PEF in the Philippines. These relate both to waste management and energy use. Several specific administrative issuances seek to regulate PEF use in the energy sector, as well as the free trade agreement between the Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand also facilitates the shipment and entry of PEF into our country. But despite the existence and presence of laws and regulations on PEF's use, existing policies fail to consider the increasing evidence of the potential harm from this PEF. This creates a dangerous situation wherein PEF use, or RDF, and WTE projects are readily accepted without a full and thorough analysis of its impacts on the health and environment and of the people. More importantly, PEF here in the Philippines is also inconsistent with several other existing laws and policies. Its use is a potential violation of the Philippine ban on incineration under the Clean Air Act. The lack of information made available to the public on PEF use, facilities, and the approval processes also can be considered a violation of the right to a clean and healthy environment under Section 16, Article 2 of the Philippine Constitution. This is exacerbated by the increasing importation of PEF and the lack of information on its use and facilities. The existing waste crisis and the continuing waste challenges of the Philippines do not make for an ideal situation to test these dangerous materials and technologies at the expense of placing the health of people and planet at risk. It is high time to reiterate our calls for a total ban on waste imports to the Philippines, which includes waste derivatives such as PEF and RDF. The government must immediately suspend the use of PEF and RDF in all facilities in the Philippines. This is to make way for conduct of a thorough and transparent multi-stakeholder scientific study and analysis of the health and environment impacts of PEF use. It is also time to hold meaningful and open consultations with stakeholders, review emission standards, as well as available technologies with focus on a cleaner production mechanism. It is also needed to align with global efforts and concerns on PEF or RDF use and climate goals target. Trade agreements can also be reviewed to ensure that these are not used to circumvent any bans or regulations. Initiatives can also seek to find alternative and viable solutions to the waste crisis. Not easy solutions or quick fix solutions which are dangerous. The government and other stakeholders should invest its time, talent, and effort in finding viable and safe solutions to the waste crisis. As I end my presentation, I would like to convey this message. The entry into our country of residual waste in the form of a cement kiln fuels is a devious disposal scheme. Developed and industrialized countries are able to get rid of its residual waste in a profitable way by converting and relabeling them as process engineered fuel for export to developing countries like ours. This is another scheme of foreign waste disposal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eileen, for that presentation from the Eco Waste Coalition. Another revealing insight into Australia's ongoing attempts to export its waste to Southeast Asia. We now have our final speaker in the lineup. Last but certainly not least is Yuyun Ismawati. Yuyun is a senior advisor and co-founder of the Nexus 3 Foundation, formerly known as Bali Focus. Yuyun has broad and rich experiences in urban environmental management, environmental health, chemicals and waste issues. Yuyun holds an environmental engineering degree from Bandung Institute of Technology and a Master of Science in Environmental Change and Management from the University of Oxford. She received the Goldman Environmental Prize in 2009 and is a steering committee member of IPEN and Break Free from Plastic. The floor is now yours, Yuyun.
Thank you so much, Lee. And thank you for IPEN, NTN, CAP, Eco Waste Coalitions for the collaboration of this project. It's very interesting that we can collaborate to work on this project. Let me share my screen. Okay. I hope you can see my screen now. Yeah, okay. Thank you. Lee already introduced Nexus 3 before. I just want to add, this is what we are doing at Nexus 3. We are advocating the chemicals and plastics additive at the upstream level and then promote the zero waste approach campaign at the middle stream level. And at the downstream level, there are several campaigns that we are running at the moment, campaigning against the false solutions, waste trade, and toxics in food chains. We have published also several reports that you can find on our website and also in the ResearchGate. Transboundary movement of RDF and SRF, solid refuse fuel, has been around since 1990s. And my colleagues, earlier speakers, already explained more or less what SRF, what RDF are. We've seen the movement also from within the Asian countries and Southeast Asian countries to another. And mostly this is biomass movement. Indonesia has, I'm using a different approach compared to my colleagues earlier. I'd like to start with the waste compositions in Indonesia that will lead to the RDF at, later on. Most of our waste are food waste and also organic, and 17% are plastics, and mostly not recyclables, only 9% of Indonesia's waste being recycled at the moment. And many of our waste ended up in the landfills. More than 50 landfills in Indonesia are currently in open dumping situations, which is very common and very often get on fire. The Indonesian regulations and policy that support solid waste management and strategy are lined up, provided with the support from the umbrella policy, and then followed with various regulations at the different levels, ministerial level, presidential decree, and also local government regulations. In addition to that, Indonesia also have the mixed energy target by 2025, which mainly to push to reduce the use of oil and coal and replace it with new sources of renewable energy and from the renewable energy. So in Indonesia, we call it EBT, energi baru dan terbarukan. So sources of the new energy and renewable energy. And at the bottom, you can see bottom right, the green one is from biomass, identified as the new source of renewable energy, counted from biomass pellets from municipal waste. And this is contributed to replace coal intentionally. There are different grades of RDFs that currently used in industrial for industrial purposes, and mainly it's RDF 5 that are used, combustible waste compressed in the form of pellets or briquettes. In some cases also industry use fluff, they call it. The bottom right with the label product, they call it fluff. It's not even shredded, and it still look like the like its original form, like packaging, sachet, and so on. You can still see clearly. And these RDFs are mostly need a treatment, have to be dried, so they will retain the calorific value, which is much needed to replace coal. In Indonesia, the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources also already identified several sources of materials, potential materials for RDF, which is mostly from agriculture waste and municipal waste, number 10 here, with the potential to generate power about 2 megawatts, which is smaller compared to rice husk and then palm oil kernel. So I don't think it's wise to push for municipal waste as RDF because it's less volume than compared to other biomass. So RDF has been promoted in Indonesia to be used in coal-fired power plants to replace coal. They call it co-firing. So they use two different terms for coal-fired power plants and cement kiln. RDF used in coal-fired power plant, or PLTU in Indonesia, we call it, is a co-firing. The replacement of coal in coal-fired power plants are between 1 to 5%. And currently, PLN, the state-owned company that generate electricity, is already tested out in more than 20 facilities or plants from 54 plants that were planned to have RDF as a to use the co-firing. Co-firing also use with different way, direct co-firing, which is the cheapest and the most common type of co-firing, and then indirect co-firing, which involve in burning the biomass first and gasify it into fuel, and then after that utilize it as a fuel to generate electricity. And then parallel co-firing that burn biomass separately, but usually used in pulp and paper industry. So for cement kilns, they call it co-processing. For cement kilns, calorific value is very important because they are a hungry calorific hungry plant. So they use a lot of alternative fuels, they call it, and including RDF from plastics. But if we look at this table on the left, the energy from RDF plastics are only, it's not as high as others. Industrial plastic is high, but in cement kiln, there are targets also, or cap of that, they call it thermal substitution rate. In Indonesia, the TSR, the thermal substitution rate target, is the EBT one, so 15 until 23%. The largest group of cement in Indonesia is cement producers is SIG, Cement Indonesia Group, Cement Indonesia Gersik used to be. And they have set the co-processing target 6 until 15%. Only SIG at the moment have this target and practice it. Other cement kiln have not started yet because they will need to have capex, new investment to modify the reception unit and so on and so on. And interestingly, in the last couple of years, FMCGs like Unilever and Danone jumped in to support the co-firing and co-processing and claim the plastic credits using verified methods and credits that's available in the market now. It sounds silly, but that's happening now. In the world, cement kiln, Austria, it has the highest thermal substitution rate, which is up until 70%. But worldwide, the thermal substitution rate is only 16% in cement kiln. So watch out also in your country. So for cement industry, the Ministry of Environment have issued regulations, emission standard for cement kiln that use RDF from municipal solid waste, and for cement kiln that use hazardous waste as a co-processing. One of the parameters is to analyze and monitor the dioxin parameter in the emissions. Interestingly and funny thing is that in Indonesia, because lack of laboratory, the cement industry only need to check and monitor their dioxins in the emissions every 4 years. And so this is a joke for all dioxin experts, including Libel. So you will be happy to poison Indonesian populations because you only need to analyze it every 4 years. Even for cement facility that use hazardous waste as a co-processing, will need to measure at least once a year, not even mandatory for 2 times a year. Another interesting development is that the Indonesian government support the public-private partnership mechanism to implement infrastructure projects. So for RDF plant, and then use of RDF for any power plants will be supported by government mechanism that will provide also VGF. So I'd like to highlight this VGF in the red circle, that this is the subsidy provided, a one-off subsidy provided by the Indonesian government through the Ministry of Finance to support projects that, if they are not supported or subsidized financially, will not be viable. So to make the project financially viable, the government provided this support. So they subsidize it to make the non-viable project, make it feasible. And poison us with the emissions and the toxic emissions and waste. So further, the support for RDF projects also strengthened with SNI. In Indonesia, we call it SNI, Standard Nasional Indonesia, that applied for RDF products that produced by anyone, with the purpose to highlight that the pellets produced by this company or that company or this project or that project already met the SNI number, So there are 4 SNI already issued for biopellets, and then for briquettes there are 2 SNI, and 3 SNI are now being discussed. However, all these SNI are voluntary. If it's not endorsed or enforced by the ministry regulation, these will not be useful. So everyone can do whatever they want to produce pellets without following any standard, because it's not enforced. So the discussions at the moment are heavily inclined to set the standards, although there is no assurance that these standards will be applied or implemented. Coming to Australia, different to the experience in the Philippines and Malaysia, in Indonesia, we have observed several importations of waste from Australia with under different names or HS codes. Thank you, Marques, you have explained what HS code is. So in Indonesia, there are several commodities coming from Australia, and we noticed that the PEF is under 3825. There is a jump in 2018, but after that it was declining. But the number of plastic waste and then paper waste coming from Australia is still quite high. And then we also started to see the investment in several places on RDF plants, including from Australia. So ResourceCo, as Jane already mentioned earlier, that they invested all over Asia. And this project in Indonesia is now in the process of design development. So to close, I would like to share these recommendations from us, that instead of allocating funds and subsidizing toxic solutions, the government should allocate funds to improve waste management system as a whole and apply zero waste approach. And then, like other colleagues, we also call for prohibitions of the importation of waste as alternative fuel under HS code 3825 and 3609690. That's for PEF. Process engineered fuel. And then, as other colleagues also call, we would like to see more and more implementations of Basel amendments effectively and strengthened our country borders. And then important issue is about the emission standards. We would like to see our government also strengthen their emission standards regulations, especially for coal-fired power plants and cement kiln. At the moment, coal-fired power plants with co-firing RDF, using RDF municipal waste, have no obligations to monitor the dioxins. So that is still missing. And the fly ash and bottom ash from coal-fired power plants, if they are using RDF now, it could be a different mixture. So new standards should be applied as well. And then due to lack of laboratory capacity, we never know how much toxic around us. And that's why we would like to call for all countries actually to increase their capacity, laboratory capacity, so they can analyze dioxins and other POPs chemicals, especially from plastic additives. No RDF productions facilities allowed to be built around residential areas, because now we've seen more and more small-scale RDF pellets have been built around residential areas for the sake of renewable energy and circular economy. And then because there is a limitation to sell RDF pellets products to cement kiln and coal-fired power plants, because they can only absorb 5% of their coal use to replace the use of coal. Then now more ideas to sell RDF for small business or small scale boilers, and this is not regulated. If it's not regulated, then there is a potential high risk of environmental and health to the public. SNI, as I mentioned earlier, it's useless, because if it's not enforced, if it's not mandatory, then it's useless to make 10 of SNIs. And then lastly, many technologies to produce RDF and also to burn RDF as a power generation plant, labeled as environmentally friendly technology, and obtain certificate from the Ministry of Environment. However, these technologies, most of the times we found the level of technology is still infant, just laboratory test scale, but they've been promoted as a sophisticated and seems like a final technology, which is, we call it the technology readiness level 9. So with all that, we hope that the existing regulatory infrastructures in Indonesia will not open up RDF importations from Australia or from other countries. So I'm happy to go for question and answer. Thank you for the opportunity. Over to you, Lee.
Great, thank you very much. That was Yuyun Ismawati of Nexus 3 presenting on the situation in Indonesia in terms of Australian exports of waste. I'd like to thank all of our esteemed speakers today who presented very interesting perspectives on the RDF problem coming from Australia and in their own countries. We're truly honoured to have you speak today. And we are now opening the floor from questions from the audience, but we would like to request that all speakers turn on their video and audio when asking a question. The speakers can choose to answer the questions live or type their answers, but I think it would be useful if the panelists could answer those questions live. I think that would be very useful. So if there are questions, perhaps people could raise their hands and we'll see if we can accommodate that. I note Jane Bremer has her hand up. Is that in response to a question?
Yes, there were a couple of questions in the Q&A. I responded to one in the box there, but I'd like to respond verbally, if I may, because it's a question that keeps being asked, and that is, well, we have this problem with plastic. It's full of toxic additives and chemicals. What can we do with it if we can't recycle it? You know, the problem of plastic is really complex and there's no easy solution. But what the solution is not is to plasticize our materials production systems further and risk poisoning the circular economy. And that's where we're headed at the moment if we don't turn off the tap to the production of non-recyclable plastics. So while it's a seductive idea to think that we could just divert these non-recyclable plastics, particularly plastic sachets, which are a scourge of the Asia-Pacific region, multi-layered composite materials that can't be easily recycled. We can just stick them in roads, we can stick them in park benches and those kinds of things, and other downcycling, what's termed as downcycling outcomes. The problem with that is that that's a pathway to the hazardous waste stream. When you put toxic non-recyclable plastics in public furniture, it can't be recycled again. So we're creating a whole new waste stream that's even more problematic. And as we know, the outcomes for hazardous waste are not good in the world, and they result in, often incineration and extreme stockpiles of toxic ash and huge problems in many countries. So the only real solution is to address the problem at the source. So the planet is overflowing with plastic, microplastics, particularly in public place furniture and in roads. Roads are a major source of microplastics into the environment already. If we flood our systems with plastic, we're just exacerbating the problem further. So the first thing we have to do is we have to turn off the tap to the generation of these problematic plastics in the first place. Then we have to redesign, and this can't be a voluntary, pie in the sky kind of, nice, idea. It has to have a legal mechanism. It has to have teeth behind it, so that countries can't dump in other countries. It has to be international standards for how we make and use plastic. And at the heart of that has to be toxics elimination, because if we don't, we're just making our materials production systems more contaminated and our waste management options more difficult. So while there's no golden solution to the problem of non-recyclable plastics, we have to start by turning off the tap, and then we have to put the onus back on those that make and produce those products to resolve the issue and take responsibility for that, because at the end of the day, it is not the consumer who's responsible. It is not the countries in the Southeast Asian region to take that problematic waste for us, whether it's in RDF or process engineered fuel or toxic recycled plastic products. We have to sheet the responsibility home to where it belongs, and that is the producers and the generators of this problem. So it's not an easy answer, but I think that's the best that I can offer.
Thank you, Jane. I would just like to draw on one other question that's in the Q&A section from one of our colleagues from Africa, who's asking if we can please advise if we could share some solutions on how to manage the high and increasing number of plastics at national level, referring to sustainable management and the continued production of toxic plastic by companies, as well as the immediate management of a lot of plastic waste already in our environment. So we have new waste, so we have new plastic waste being produced, and we already have a stockpile, if you like, of plastic waste that's been there for a long time. So as engineers, as NGOs, we're supposed to know concrete ecological solutions for better awareness and sensitization of the government and other stakeholders. And what would our response be to that? Would one of the panelists like to try and answer that question, which is how should NGOs advise their government? And Jane has just pointed out a number of issues, but how would NGOs advise their government on tackling the plastic pollution issue in their country? Is there any of the other panelists who would like to answer?
Yes, thank you, Lee, for the question. For Eco-Waste Coalition, I think if our government is having that problem, one thing that we would be advising them is that first, reduce the plastic production. Plastic industry is kept on producing new plastics because virgin plastics are much cheaper than recycling them. So reduce plastic production. And then it is also good to ban single-use plastics. corporations and manufacturers should find a way, should find alternative delivery system so that their products will be accessed by the people, not in single-use plastics. Then it is also good to impose extended producer's responsibility. So those who are making these products and proliferating, helping in the proliferation of the plastic pollution should also be responsible in collecting them and in managing them, especially these are residual waste. And lastly, ban all the plastic chemical additives in making products. So it will be easier to recycle them. So I guess those are viable steps and solutions that a government and the manufacturing or corporate industries can work together, because people or the consumers are just at the back end of what they are producing and what we are seeing at the stores. So guess I help and give some suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eileen. Any other panelists like to respond to that question? Okay, I had one further question that was raised in the Q&A. I might just paraphrase, where there was a question about recycling of plastics and whether that contributes to recycling toxic materials. And I was wondering if any of the panelists would like to say a few words about what that means, because we've all been told that recycling is what we should do with our plastic. We should source, separate and send it for recycling. So on the one hand, we're told that recycling is a good thing for the environment and we should continue to do that. But on the other hand, there's this concern about toxic additives in plastics then moving through the recycling chain. Would any of the panelists like to comment on that? And it's fine if they don't, and maybe I can add a few words about it as well. But if there's someone would like to, that looks like Yuyun's hand up. Yuyun, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Lee. This is the thing, you know, so we don't have information about what's in it. What's in that plastic? What kind of chemicals in that plastic? Even if we have a good knowledge, we never know what's in the plastic. And when that toxic chemicals do not disclose to us and it keeps recycled, I don't know until how many times, probably only until 5 to 7 times being recycled. And the more they recycled, the toxic chemicals is more accumulated in that product. So black plastics are the worst because they are have been recycled several times, so downgraded until the color of the plastics are black. And the informations about the chemicals in the products also depending on the laboratory capacity. If you don't have good laboratory in your country, you will never find out what's in it, including the new POPs, which is mostly and mainly discussed under the Stockholm Convention. And I hope countries join also participate actively in Stockholm Convention forum and COPs, because following Stockholm Convention, you will know more about what chemicals are being banned and eliminated or agreed to be eliminated globally. So for developing countries who don't have any laboratory capacity, I think we have to supply them with informations, and the scientists also collaborate with other scientists in developed countries, which has more facilities and laboratories. We have to help each other. And I hope Tadesse also can share what is the global plastic resolutions that will be coming up. Will it be addressed also in the Global Plastic Treaty? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yuyun. I see I've got hands up with Magus, and we are getting close to time. Yeah. So I'll just give the floor to Magus, and perhaps she can answer the next question. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just make it short. As Yuyun had pointed out, Malaysia's recycling industry is really a lucrative industry, and we have found that a lot of that's why a lot of plastic waste is being exported to Malaysia. But what we found was, as we mentioned, there's like lack of laboratories to check in terms of what are in the pellets, which have been recycled. And what we had done together with IPEN, we had sent samples of HDPE plastic pellets to Arnica in Czechoslovakia to test, and we found that the pellets from Malaysia had all these toxic additives. For example, brominated flame retardants, BFRs, the UV stabilizers, the BPA, and these pellets are being exported to other countries to make into new products. So that's why we are saying it's like it is going to be toxic, and this is only the ones that we had tested. We don't know what other toxic chemicals are actually in those plastic pellets that are resins that are being produced to make into new products. So this is really, so what we have been calling for is to, even in the UNEA, to have chemicals in the plastics treaty to remove all these toxic additives. So, and this should be in the design of new plastic products. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Megas. There is just one more question in the Q&A, and I think I'll answer that one just briefly, being from Australia. And it was asking if Australia's recycling capabilities, which have increased over the last few years, are not enough to handle our domestic waste. Is it not enough? And the answer is no. Australia is a very wasteful society, probably has one of the highest per capita plastic waste generation rates in the world. And we have a very outdated waste management system that is not capable of managing it at this point. But that doesn't mean we need to export this waste to other countries that have even less capacity. So I think that's one thing to consider. The other part of the question is whether Australia is the only country we should be aware of in terms of deceitfully exporting waste. I'm sure it's not the only country. And if you have a look at the map that Yu Yun presented in her presentation, which shows a number of blue and red arrows moving around in Southeast Asia, there are other countries that are exporting this type of material as well. And there could also be new players coming into the field from Europe, which has particularly the UK, which has a well-established RDF industry and is always looking for exports as their European market has shrunk more recently due to Brexit and other considerations, including a tax on incineration of this material in some countries in Europe. So there are other countries that will be doing similar things, and it's taken these 4 organizations and these 4 women leaders from Southeast Asia to expose this problem to a worldwide audience, and we thank them for that. And I think more light will be shined now on what's happening in the rest of the world in terms of this RDF situation. But and yes, we will be sharing the recording, I believe, and we will send notifications out with respect to that. But we do need to wrap up now in terms of Q&A. But just before we do, and other than thank you to the speakers for patiently answering questions and so on, we'd like to just invite Tadesse, if he's still available, to make a couple of closing remarks. But I'm not sure if the technical issues prevent him from doing that. Tadesse, are you there? I think we may have lost him, or he's been drawn into the UNEA proceedings to see if he can halt more plastic waste exports. So we'll skip that for the moment. And I'd just like to see if we can call on people to activate their cameras briefly to see if we can take a group photo of the webinar. I'm not very good at these things, but I think our technical team could do that.
Vista is back.
Sorry, I was dropped off. The connection here is very bad with around 2,000 people.
I see. Sorry to this. It was a delay there. Would you like to make a couple of closing remarks for the webinar? And I'm sorry we lost you earlier.
Yeah, thank you really very much. And I'm very thankful to all the presenters. The points that are raised here are very important for the future negotiation processes. It will be a very good input because there are still unfinished negotiation points that are going to be included, especially with the recycling aspects, with the health, and also with the chemical additives, which would like to be considered in the future negotiation aspects. But this is really high time to raise this issue because the door is already opened. We are very glad for a discussion. INC is coming, and in the coming 2 years, we hope that we will have a legally binding international agreement, but we have to fight that these issues are going to be included and loopholes are closed. Having said this, I am really very grateful to all the presenters, participants, and everyone. And this is not a fight given only for IPEN and for the public sector. It is a fight for every individual and the citizen. So we have to collaborate together, to work together, and to come up with a solution in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tadesse Amera, co-chair of IPEN from UNEA in Nairobi. We really appreciate your contribution. And if you wouldn't mind staying for just a few more moments, and we'll take a group photo. So if everybody participating in the webinar can turn on their camera, I believe that our IT person, Ken, will be able to take a group shot. I'll wait till somebody messages me to say whether they've been successful. Thanks very much, everybody. And with that said, I'll bring the webinar to a close. Thank you to all the participants and speakers who attended, to our small but mighty IT team, and to everyone else who supported this particular webinar. Thank you very much. And I believe at this point we will wrap up proceedings, but please be aware that there is a post-webinar survey that will flash on your screen, and we would appreciate it if you could fill that out, and the recordings will be available at some point in the near future. Thank you, everybody, and thanks for attending. Goodbye.